now my privilege to introduce you to our first speaker, and that's the Honourable Tim Watts. Tim Watts is currently Assistant or Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that kind introduction. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us here today. Let me also acknowledge my friends from the Diplomatic Corps who are with us in strong numbers here today, and particularly ministers from the continent of Africa who've made the journey to visit us here in Perth. As a Foreign Affairs Minister, I know what that is like. It's a long flight. Thank you for making the effort to be with us here today. Thank you for the invitation to speak here again today. I was reflecting that I've attended Africa Down Under in every year since I came into my role as Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, and it's quickly become one of the fixtures on my ministerial calendar. It's always refreshing to come here to Perth, to Australia's Indian Ocean capital, to really be able to benefit from the different mindset, the different outlook that we have here on Australia's western coast. And particularly in that respect, to be able to say g'day across the very big pond of the Indian Ocean to our neighbours in the African continent. Before I make a few remarks, I should tell you that my boss, Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, very much wanted to be here. We talk about African Australian issues regularly inside the portfolio, but because of her other commitments, she was not able to be here. But she has recorded a video message for everyone here, which I'm told we will now be able to play.
Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of Perth, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm delighted to record this message for the 22nd Gathering of Africa Down Under. Australia is home to one of the oldest continuous civilisations on Earth, and home to people from more than 300 ancestries. Half of the Australian population was born overseas or has a parent who was born overseas. When we look to the world, to Asia, to Europe, to Africa, we see our own reflection, and we have sought to reflect this rich character back to the world. Almost 500,000 Australians of African origin form an integral part of our multicultural, social and economic fabric. Sharing common ground with so many of the world's peoples means Australians want to see the interests of all the world's peoples upheld, along with our own. And we know we can only solve our biggest problems by working together with other countries that share our vision for peace, stability and prosperity. Not only that, but we know the world's biggest goals, sustainable development, addressing climate change, achieving net zero, powering the world, simply cannot be achieved without the nations of Africa. Working together to achieve our common interests is not simply a choice, it's a necessity. The African Union's membership of the G20 reflects both Africa's contribution to the global economy and its rightful and crucial role in shaping the economic and financial future of our world. That is only one part of the story. Africa should be represented on the Security Council. As the UN Secretary-General has said, African voices, insights and participation must be brought to bear across the Council's deliberations and actions. Australia has heard the voices of the nations of Africa, voices that have sought partnership on equal terms, voices that have called on us to recognise the unity of Africa and also its diversity. Australia's work in Africa has tried to achieve just that. Our engagements are tailored to the needs of the countries with whom we work. We've worked to support food security and resilience to climate change, supported local efforts in counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism, and provided humanitarian assistance where need is most acute. We are making great progress in trade and investment collaboration. In recent years, Australian investment in Africa has risen to $60 billion. This represents a long-term commitment to Africa's future. Australian businesses in mining, renewable energy and education services are helping to provide skills, add value and generate sustainable benefits for local communities. Africa is already central to the global economy and international security. and this role in the world will only get bigger. And Australia's relationship with the countries of Africa will only get stronger. Have a great Africa Down Under. Thank you.
Well, as the Foreign Minister said just then, since I came into this role, I've paid special attention to highlighting the importance of Africa to Australian interests. And I've worked hard to advance Australia-Africa relations. And this is because Africa is important to the world, to Australia, to our shared futures. As the Foreign Minister just mentioned, last year we welcomed the Africa Union as a member of the G20. This was a significant moment, not only in Africa's story, but in the story of our global economy. Prior to the African Union's entry, the G20 represented 2/3 of the world's population, 75% of global trade, and 85% of global GDP. The African Union's entry has added 1.4 billion people and almost $3 trillion in GDP to those figures. This reflects the fact that there is no global economy without Africa. Africa will have the world's largest potential workforce by 2030. Africa's middle class is projected to grow to over 1 billion people by 2060. Before the end of this century, the biggest cities in the world will be African cities. These are simply staggering projections, and they can't be ignored. The message is crystal clear. Africa is not arriving, Africa is here. Now, it's true that Australia's foreign policy has an Indo-Pacific focus, given that the Indo-Pacific is our neighbourhood. But while Australia is not a global power, we do have global interests. Nowhere is that more clear than the interests that we pursue with our partners in Africa. I'm pleased that, in the broad, Australia-Africa ties are expanding to meet the future's global challenges. We have long worked together in multilateral forums, and that's why Australia is committed to UN reform and to a UN that better reflects and represents the world of the 21st century. This includes greater representation for Africa on the UN Security Council. Africa's continued rise over the course of this century will have a monumental influence on the trajectory of the world as a global engine for growth, as a major partner in the global transition to net zero, and as a key partner in international peace and security. Australia can play a constructive role in Africa's rise because Australia and Africa share many commonalities. We're both blessed with natural endowments of critical minerals. Rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, nickel. I'm sure that many of you here know the full list. The World Bank has reported that we will need to increase the extraction of these minerals by 5-fold by 2050 if we are to meet the demand for clean energy technologies. So whether it's solar, wind, or geothermal technology, the raw material needed to help power the future will first need to be mined out of the earth, whether that's here in Australia or across the Indian Ocean in Africa. Australian interests in Africa represent a long-term commitment to commonalities and to the prosperity of these communities. As the Foreign Minister has said, in recent years, the investment by Australian companies has risen to around $60 billion. Such investments provide jobs, training, expertise, opportunities. And they come with new infrastructure and deliver significant benefits to local communities. Australians are proud of Australian mining, of Australian innovation, of Australian ingenuity. Companies are also increasingly looking to process minerals in Australia, supported by the government's Future Made in Australia incentives. And I'm proud that a range of Australian companies also support value addition in Africa, whether that be the smelting of manganese alloys or the refining of heavy mineral sands, or the largest aluminium smelter in the Southern Hemisphere, located in South Africa. By adding value to raw minerals, we can create more jobs and support new market opportunities in the process. And that desire applies to all Australian companies investing in Africa, not only to the resources sector. I'm confident that Australian companies can continue to work together with their partners in Africa to deliver economic growth and prosperity in socially accountable and environmentally responsible ways. That's the only way we'll meet the scale-up required to meet that net zero challenge. The Australian Government will continue to support these partnerships. In December 2023, we ran a mining governance short course for 25 African officials, which has supported African governments to develop and regulate their mining sectors. We will run another mining governance short course in the coming year. And Australia's High Commission in Accra will convene the next West African Mining Security Conference in October, which brings together African and Australian experts to discuss how best to navigate regional security trends and operational challenges. As the Prime Minister said in her message, our engagements have always been adapted to the needs of the countries that we are working with, prioritising listening over lecturing. Australia's views about and affinity with Africa is defined by who we are as Australians ourselves. As Australia's population has changed, so have our views become more nuanced and our links with Africa more pronounced. Almost 500,000 Australians had declared themselves in the last census to be of African heritage. My own electorate is one of the most multicultural, diverse electorates in Australia. Around 2/3 of my voters are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. And it's home to one of the country's largest African-Australian diaspora communities and a large population of African international students. And with that come enriching cultural and family ties from Australia to all of the nations of the African continent. So Africa's future is not an abstraction for me or my local community. It's a future in which we all have a personal stake. And as their member, it's a future in which I have a particular personal stake. The continent is going to be an enormous global player in our lifetimes because of its people, because of its economies, because of its role in the international system. There simply isn't a future where the countries of Africa are not important to Australia. You all know that, but I want to make it clear that the Australian government knows that too. So have a great Africa Down Under, make the most of it. I'm looking forward to engaging with you all. Thank you.